Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you everybody for coming to my session, Customer Identity and Access Management Architectures of the Future, or something that we sometimes call CIAM, or Customer/Consumer Identity Management. My name is Bjorn Aannestad. I'm the Director of Product Management at Unbound ID. Pleased to see all of you here today. I understand that my name is the most clicked on one in the speaker list in the app. And I can assure you that's just an accident because my globally unique identifier happens to come soon in the alphabet, come first in the alphabet. And then there's a follow-on phenomenon, I'm sure, which is that all the identirati look at the app and say, who the hell is that guy and why is he first instead of me? So there's an amplification phenomenon there. So much for data science. Anyway, thanks for coming today. We're going to talk about the identity-centric future. You know, we often talk about wanting to have identity be at the center of whatever it is that's in the future. Well, what is it that we really mean by that? Well, I think we mean that we would like to be the center of an ecosystem. But what kind of ecosystem do we really want to have identity at the center of? Odds are that it's going to be an information and data ecosystem, of course. Right? Because we talk a lot about wanting to move beyond authentication as the identity and access management value proposition. And we do that for a couple of reasons. It's kind of altruistic in a way. We believe as professionals in this business, I think, that by putting identity at the center of a virtual ecosystem, we actually have the best way of ensuring online privacy, online security, and online convenience in the solutions that companies provide. Okay? So this image happens to be one of a big data ecosystem, and each of those logos there is a vendor in that space. Okay? But there are a couple of other ecosystems that we might participate in and inject identity into the center of and take an identity-centric view. This one is the marketing technology landscape, and you can see there's a whole lot of stuff going on there. It's a very crowded space. These are the companies that do loyalty programs, do behavioral analytics, and when we say that identity should be the center of customer experience, this is the ecosystem we're talking about, and clearly there are a lot of interconnections there. Right? This particular ecosystem is currently playing on a fine line between knowing an awful lot about me in an anonymous profile way and determining as much as it can about me and about us, but not quite crossing the line into knowing exactly who we are. So this is all about anonymous profiles so far. There would be a huge business value here if we could cross that line and have all this behavioral information actually represent a known individual user. But of course, the flip side of that is all the privacy concerns and all the issues of coming into our personal lives. So we have to be very careful with that. Okay? It's a pretty simple idea, though, in a way, because if you think about it, the point at which a user or a customer is authenticated, or in today's password-less world, recognized, that's the first touch point of interacting with the customer. So there's a lot of value there for those. The next ecosystem is the Internet of Things ecosystem. And this one's still in what we might call a primordial stage. It's still figuring out how to subdivide itself into different categories. The Internet of Connected Cars, the Connected Home, Industrial Internet of Things, Healthcare, right? And there are similar sub-ecosystems of this evolving around connected clothing, connected kids, connected toothbrushes, and all kinds of things. Okay? So what do we as identity and access management professionals want to bring to these ecosystems? Well, most fundamentally, there's that unique identifier, right? The personality is keyed to a globally unique ID for a person, right? But we also want to bring authentication and single sign-on, of course. We bring to these ecosystems authorization and access management, though we often have to explain what that actually means and where those two terms fit into the larger picture of just security, under security. And we talk a lot about profiles of people. In a data ecosystem, we bring demographics about people. In a consumer experience ecosystem, we bring opt-in and opt-out data. We bring preferences about people that are part of a profile. And in an Internet of Things ecosystem, we can bring information about the relationships between the device and the person who owns or controls that device. And why is that important? Well, identity centrism is important because as the world moves to everything is a service business model, we move away from anonymous products. Take a very prosaic example, a toothbrush, a connected toothbrush. These actually exist. If you have kids, you might want to look up the connected toothbrush and make them actually brush more. But instead of being an anonymous plastic gadget that anybody picks up in the grocery store, the connected toothbrush now has to have a model of probably two people. One, the person who's brushing is being tracked, and number two, the parent who bought that device and is responsible for the privacy, the award giving, et cetera, about that. You know, for all I know, the connected toothbrush might even report your brushing habits to the CHA, which is the Central Hygienist Agency. So that could also be possible. But the point is that instead of just being a product, in order to deliver a service, we have to have identities in the mix as part of that architecture. A less goofy example than the toothbrush, perhaps, is a simple one like a fleet management system, where if you allow the drivers of the fleet trucks to take their trucks home at night, you need to model the individual and their relationship to that truck so that you can respect their privacy as they drive around, and when they're off the clock, they take the truck home. You have to have a way of knowing who is able to see that data about where they live, which school they stop at, which doctor's offices they stop at. And without a model of that driver and their privacy, you can't really implement an adequate system that way. Later today, there's an even more interesting example, which is the Motorola Connected Cop in our masterclass this afternoon. So I encourage you to take a look at that as well. The Connected Cop is a very interesting example of that. So in each of the ecosystems that I talked about, the data, the customer experience, and the IoT, so far it's about an anonymous user, right? We can't really tie Sarah and her preferences to an anonymous car and expect to provide a personalized service to her for her car, right? Those of us in this room know that it's difficult enough to actually federate identities when both systems have a similar concept of a user. You've got a user in Active Directory, I've got a user over here in my database. Let's try to map those one-to-one. That's tough enough. But what happens when the information system in the ecosystem doesn't actually even have a concept of a user? Let me give you an example here of one. Here's a website. I'm not going to reveal the company, but if you just read this superficially, this looks like yet another competitor to those of us who are vendors in the identity and access management space. You know, read what it says. Secure identity for everything. Internet of Things security with identity as a service. Oh dear, another competitor with a nice-looking website. But if you scroll a little further on this one, you see that this is actually a cryptography company. Their identity as a service is actually key management in the cloud. There is no concept of a person here in identity. This is the identity of the device itself. Okay, so it's missing the user, AKA the human, which is what we want to bring to these ecosystems. Because traditionally in the identity and access management space, we know a lot about the user. That's our core data object, is the person, right? So the questions I want to ask and address here today are, What do we need to add to our identity and access management architectures, or our customer-consumer identity and access management architectures, in order to be compatible with and to contribute to the solutions that are being delivered in those three ecosystems? What do we need to add to the architectures in order to be useful to development teams? Because we can't just bring services there, we actually have to bring something that the development teams are going to find expedites their time to market, makes it easier for them to write reliable code, removes the need to reinvent the wheel, right? And then finally, of course, how do we increase the value prop of those systems by putting identity in the center of them? So the way I'd like to walk through that is centering it on me, myself, right? So these are the 5 areas that I think consumer identity and access management or customer identity and access management needs to focus on. This is different from the focus areas of the traditional IAM space, okay? So of course we start with how do you know it's really me, the authentication problem. Then there's a focus area around data that describes me, right? What do I say about myself? What do I tell you? What choices do I make? What do I opt into? What do I opt out of? What are my preferences? What's my privacy sensitivity? Relationships to companies, to organizations, to perhaps other people in my household with whom I share a service, like a television subscription service or whatever that might be. Rules that need to be obeyed just because of who I am, whether I'm an EU citizen or a minor or somebody with a particular medical condition. These are the types of things that we have to take into account. And then, of course, the things I own, the control relationships I have over devices. Okay? So each of these categories, I believe, is not being handled, at least not holistically, by the solutions that are being delivered in those ecosystems. By adding identity into the middle of it, we can start to deliver on this. There's also a strong interplay between these when it comes to making automated decisions about how to use data, how to use privacy and anonymity. Because if I'm going to share data as a solution with another organization, or if I'm going to collect data about something a person controls, the rules that have to be obeyed are one of the major considerations there in how that's done automatically. Okay. And it's less than ideal to have these various capabilities spread amongst different systems. I mean, we can see that in very simple examples, like this one. Here is a non-unified profile. I've blacked out the name of the programs here to protect the guilty. But when I went to this site and I said, update my preferences, they felt compelled to show me this dialog box, which is a dead giveaway that they don't have a unified view of me. Not only is that inconvenient, that once I've made my changes in one place, I need to go to 6 other places to make commensurate changes. But I think most importantly is that this company has no way of guaranteeing across their services that they are following and respecting my preferences, because I've had to express them differently in different places for different parts of the service. For them, that could even be brought into a business liability, because how in the world do they audit that they're respecting the terms of service for each of these when there are so many different places to keep track of that? Okay? So when I want to make changes to a preference, the way something behaves, you know, you and I think we're starting to build the expectation that within a company and across companies, the preferences I make one place will start to be respected other places. And the only way to get that distributed consistency of preferences is, you know, a little counterintuitively, I think, by having a unified model of the customer and their preferences in one place that can be used and reused across all the services. All right, so the architecture from the top down, these are the things I'm going to go through in a little bit more detail here. So the list of capabilities that I think earns us the right to help solve those problems in those ecosystems are these, right? It's clear, I think, to me at least, and probably a lot of other people, that identity is not yet everybody's assumption that it has to be built into those ecosystems. So we, in this space, the identity space, have to earn the right to participate in the solutions being delivered in those ecosystems. And the invitations that we get as either vendors or as IAM practitioners within our companies are going to depend on one thing first, and that's providing authentication. That's what we're known for. That's what people look to us for. That's what we provide that nobody else wants to reinvent. Okay? But even those are changing, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in another slide. To be useful to the application development teams, we have to be able to support queries that reflect the complexity of the model I was just talking about, right? We have to be able to expose a model of identity and all those relationships and attributes so that application developers can take advantage of it. And to be valuable to the business, our identity stack has to participate in analytics, and it has to be able to provide notifications out to operational systems. Okay? And then one last piece that's not really represented here is that the identity system is where we need to implement the privacy and policy decisions, because the results of those decisions are fundamentally functions of who I am as an individual. Like I said, well, my citizenship, my age, my status as a customer, potentially stature, I suppose, if I spend a lot. You could look at it that way. Okay. So take these things. Authentication, we have to provide. Modeling so that applications can take advantage of the identity, we have to provide. And then we have to be able to participate in the expectation of providing value through event streams and outbound notifications. So let's look at those one at a time. Okay. So working our way up from the bottom, from the data layer here, the ability to stream events, and these could be authentication events, they could be recognition events to analytic systems like Teradata for customer journey analysis. When you look at a lot of those vendors in the marketing technology space, they're about analyzing that stream of data. So there's an expectation now that any system that touches the customer will contribute to that stream of data. Right? We also have to be able to provide outbound notifications. The old model of access management and identity was a system wants to verify a user's identity, so they make an inbound call to our stack and say, tell me about this user, are they valid, is their account good, et cetera. We have to flip that around in order to provide value. Now, when a customer comes in and changes a privacy option, or they add a device to their profile, or they provision a new service, we have to have mechanisms to push that out to the operational systems and make that part of the service that we provide, right? We're moving, in a word, from what we used to think about importing data, right? The way that these systems are architected today is all about publish and subscribe. And the new vocabulary word for us is ingest. Right? It's not import, it's actually a stream. I'm just continually ingesting data. And that's how those operational systems are being architected today on various cloud services like Amazon's IoT cloud and so on. So in order to play nice there and provide value, we've got to start contributing to that data stream. Every time a customer touches us, every time a customer changes their profile. Okay? All right, the next one is the modeling and the queries. So if we decide that identity should be at the center of things, and part of that is the relationship that I have to companies, the terms of service I signed up, the people in my household, the things I own and control, we can expect that application developers are going to want to ask about that data. And historically, identity systems, directories in particular, have been very good at answering one type of question very, very quickly. And that is, look up this user ID and give me the data about them. Right? That's what you do for authentication. That's what you do for account verification and so on. We need to build out further than that. For years, we've had the ability to do relational RDBMS type joins of data. But we're now going to have to build queries and a query engine on top of our stack that allows somebody to do what is actually driving the graph query type applications now, or the graph query database usage, which is look up this person and give me auxiliary data about them, right? One of Unbound ID's early experiences in this realm was with an online e-commerce retailer. And their application teams wanted to be able to, at login time, not only retrieve the user's core profile, but also their payment card data and all the ship-to addresses that they had configured so that they could improve the latency of the customer experience and have fewer round trips to the server. Now think about that for a second. I'm logging in the user, so there's an identity piece and authentication piece. I'm getting payment card data, that's PII, right? And I'm also getting address data and preferences about where my default ship to is. So all of those things wrapped up in one query that we could serve out of the CIM system, the Consumer Identity and Access Management System. Okay? Another thing that we really are obligated to do here, and I think this is just smart, and Ishan's going to talk about this a little bit later, is provide the application developers a place to have their own namespace where they can store application-specific data so that they don't feel the need to go and set up another user database. And they can augment the profile with what they need for their own application services. So that's another piece of this that we need to start providing. Okay, the next step is the response back. How do you respond back to a query like that? Well, this is where the privacy comes in, and the, whether we de-identify the data, whether we allow the request, right? And I'd like to make the point that this response is more than what's typically called access management. We're not just authorizing the application to make the query. We're actually making decisions at a fine-grained level about what data to respond with. And the answer may be different for each person, right? I may have configured it to be okay to share my current weight. You may not. So as an application comes and asks for users' weights, some of it will be in the result, some of it will be blocked from the result. Some applications will get de-identified versions of that data. Some applications will get elided versions of that data. But all of that is a function of identity profile information that's in our system in the first place. So it makes logical sense to me that when we respond to the query, the identity system should be making some decisions about what goes back out in the response. Okay, third, the rules that we have to obey because I am who I am. This one gets a little complicated. I'm just going to give it a light touch here. But there's a very important architectural piece. This is a very real-world problem in the customers that I talk to. And that has to do with what you might call governance of data at rest. Similar to encryption, a little bit analogous to encrypting data at rest. But you know the EU regulations about where data is actually stored physically. It has to be physically in an EU data center. It can't be in a US data center. It can't be in a Central American data center, et cetera. For operational reasons, we really want to have one big global customer database. But because of these legal obligations and practical reasons, we actually have to store the data physically separate. So we need an architecture that can give us physical separation of the data, but a logical unification. And to do that, you need a proxy capability, and you need runtime enforcement of access so that data isn't retrieved from one place where it's not supposed to be retrieved from, or moved to a data store where it's not allowed to be stored. You also have to do runtime enforcement of anonymization, masking, and de-identification, right? The two main use cases that drive this are actually reporting. So if I have a large global customer database and I'd like to do aggregate reporting, I can't move all that profile data into another system and then report on it because I'm now violating the storage requirement. So I have to be able to de-identify it on its way to my reporting database. And that has to happen based on identity factors. Okay. All right, and then the last one is back to authentication, our old favorite. How do you know it's really me? And the change I alluded to here is kind of an interesting one. And we might think that single sign-on and so on has already been a solved problem, but I can prove to you that it's not. Here's another example where we've changed the names to protect the guilty. This is a financial institution's login page. Clearly, there's money to be made here for implementing single sign-on, and there's a project ahead. Each of those blue buttons is a separate sign-in button for a different one of their services. So this problem isn't quite yet solved, at least not for everybody. If you'd like to find out how ping identity and unbound ID work together to solve this problem, stop by the booth later, and we'd be happy to give you some demos and show you how that works. All right, so back to authentication. How do I know it's really me, and what's the change that I see here? The change I see is that instead of authentication being the core service of the SIM stack, the core service has to actually be orchestration of authentication. Authentication is now happening more at the edges, on the devices, just recognition of a device I've done before. It could be a thumbprint on a device. So our architecture has to change from being simply a login service where everybody logs in the same way to actually being an orchestration layer for different authentication, different recognition protocols that might vary for each given user depending on the context, the device they happen to be using, their preferences, and so on. The other important part about this is that this authentication world, the technologies are changing very quickly. And the best authentication system is the one that has the highest combination of convenience and accuracy. And if you bake that too hard into your stack, then you won't be able to adapt quickly when a new, better protocol comes out. And your customers start to say, hey, you know, these guys are no longer asking me for my password. Can't you do that, right? So rather than finding a way to bolt on a new authentication system, or worse yet, replace your authentication system, I think we want to move to an architecture where we can make a call out to a proofing service, whichever one's appropriate for our demographic, whichever one has the highest, positive match rate, the lowest false positives. Use that data to come back and then start making the appropriate calls out to the authentication services that we can get from one-off providers. And maybe picking a social login as well. Okay, so that pretty much sums it up. In sum, the way we handle authentication has to change. It's not multiple factors in a risk formula, it's actually an orchestration concept. The modeling has to change to be able to provide a richer response to queries, both in terms of the combinations of data, the types of filtering that we make, and embedding privacy and data protection into the result back. And then finally, we have to be able to play nice in those large ecosystems by allowing other systems to ingest the events that happen within the identity-centric architecture. Okay? So that's my time for today. Thank you very much. And if you have questions, follow-ups, et cetera, stop by the booth. I'll be there this afternoon. Thank you.